Great. So what we're going to talk about now for the next 45 minutes are the drivers that we're seeing towards adoption of different approaches to quality and the ways in which organizations have been struggling and needing to have a different level of visibility. And we saw the video just now, the way that CAST is presenting itself is often what I see with many of the clients that I deal with. They don't have that visibility or a way to understand what's going on actually with the code that they're depending on and relying on. And so the way I wanted to start this was talking about the ways in which we see organizations publicly failing due to that lack of visibility. So there was a week I went on vacation during August 2013. And during that week, there were about 7 very, very public failures from Amazon, for instance, Goldman Sachs. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange went down. The NASDAQ went down. And also the Eurex went down, all when I happened to be away. So I had some calls from clients and from reporters and other people afterwards saying, Melinda, why weren't you around to comment on this? And we're finding that those stories are not decreasing. Who among you have read stories, even in the last month or so, about very significant failures that have been, right? I mean, I'm sure people are waking up perhaps after lunch, but it's something that drives action and investment on the part of organizations because they don't want to be that next failure, right? One of the more obvious, some of the more obvious ones since that 2013 timeframe were the obviously Obamacare, very visible, very, very challenging and problematic to some of my family members who rely on it. JetBlue, very significant issues. Target, very public. I heard someone on NPR talking about how he wasn't even going to bring credit cards to Target anymore. He's only going to bring cash. That's definitely a de-evolution of our economy when people begin to think that way. Home Depot and JP Morgan Chase. So these are just some examples of the many which all of us have read about and have seen as or heard about on the news or NPR or whatever you use for your news service or whatever, Twitter. So the key here is that this high cost of inertia, basically. And what we're seeing is the multimodal platforms that organizations have to deploy their applications on, ranging from mobile to leveraging social systems of engagement, deploying on the cloud, and then using big data analytics. These combined factors increase complexity significantly, and also the pressures on organizations to change how they're approaching quality and how they're thinking about their core assets. We're looking at this increasing level of complexity in the context of decreased budgets, both from a financial perspective and a human resource perspective. Who here is seeing decrease in their personnel in the organization to be able to build and manage code and move it forward? I think that I probably, I'm seeing that across my client base. And a need to prioritize those scarce resources, as well as these resources not being knowledgeable about these emerging areas, either singly or in combination with each other. So how do you deal with that, right? The evolution of Agile. Well, I've been doing some research also on the growth of Agile, what we call Agile ALM, so across different phases of development, from project quality and also looking at process management for some of the key Agile players. So very significant use of Agile in the development shops that IDC supports, but we're also seeing a carryover into business. So the use of Agile by business organizations to shift how they think about product planning, okay? But that also throws a wrench into the works around quality and testing. How do you actually engage in Agile ways with your quality approaches to be able to manage what you're dealing with? I know Bill's going to talk later about the crash report that he put out, that he and several others at CAST put together, which is quite interesting, and the combination of both Agile with existing waterfall approaches, which he'll speak to. So how do you balance this as you're moving forward as an organization? And then complex sourcing. When we talk about complex sourcing at IDC, we don't just mean using systems integrators offshore. We're also looking at the ways in which organizations are leveraging open source components, for instance, and how you manage both internal resources, external resources, and then the components that you're getting from open source as well. So, and then the use of open source automation as well. How do you pull that together with your existing automated tools that you have in-house? So this is challenging. We're finding that these diverse deployment demands for mobile, social, cloud, and also emerging embedded systems where products are being driven by a competitive position by the software that drives these products, that's demanding a different approach to quality. And many of my friends and siblings and other analyst firms also are finding this as well, that old ways of thinking about quality are insufficient. We're not just talking about functional testing and regression testing. We need to be thinking clearly and understanding the analytics about what's going on under the covers with the code that you have on which you rely. And so as we're seeing organizations reinvesting in this context and having to do more with these more constrained resources, it's not more with less. In many instances for the companies I deal with, it's more with nothing. So how do you go forward and deal with this? And one way, one aspect of it is automation. Automation in and of itself is insufficient. You have to use tools well. A fool with a tool is, of course, still a fool. That old adage remains the same. So, from a process perspective, you have to shift and be able to leverage these good automation tools in appropriate contexts. However, we're finding that that's helping organizations that I deal with to be able to be more effective at what they're doing from a code quality perspective, and we'll get more into that as we move forward. I talked about the complex sourcing and offshoring. We're also finding that there's this need for effective code management and metrics enabled by software quality analysis and measurement, which is the market I'll be discussing in a moment, and defining clearly is enabling organizations to be more effective. I think someone earlier today in the discussion talked about the shift from project-oriented types of usages of quality pre-deployment to beginning to think about DevOps, so post-deployment. How do you take your thinking from individualized components that are, that are actually fractured from one another to an understanding of what the integration means across them and what the impact is going to be from a quality, vulnerability, and also performance perspective, how you optimize that, okay? We saw in that first slide the challenges of not dealing effectively with that, and there are also security vulnerabilities which are increasingly an issue. Globalization, so the economic competition and local compliance needs and issues that are impacting all of the major companies that IDC deals with, and many of the smaller companies who have relationships with those larger companies. So the software that's driving these businesses, again, has to be well structured, and the understanding of what's going on there is extremely important as these companies try to be more adaptive, and you all fall in that category, I expect. A move towards services creation and the need to understand the ways in which, say, for instance, APIs become the glue for mobile apps, for instance, and then how services play a role, understanding that impact as well in coordination for a lot of the software that we're dealing with is important. Security is huge. And I find in many of the companies that I deal with that there's not a good connection between the CISO, the Chief Security Officer, and the people that are doing quality. Historically, that's been the case all too frequently. What I'm finding now is that as a result of these kinds of public failures that no one wants to be the next example for, if that sentence made sense, there is beginning to be coordination and understanding that quality and security have to be married to one another, that you need to think from the get-go as you're architecting and designing your applications about what the end result's going to be from a security and a quality perspective, that it has to be thought about from this end-to-end kind of context. And so these security issues are, interestingly enough, driving an understanding from the more mature organizations that I deal with of how to bring those two pieces together from an analytics perspective. And the ad hoc approaches that have typically been the case with many of the organizations that we deal with are just unsustainable and really quite scary to organizations who are seeing these very public kinds of failures that we talked about. End user experience, when we look at mobile applications, for instance, the two key factors that prevent someone from that actually lead to ditching of mobile applications are, one is performance. If it's slow, forget it. I'll go to something else. The other is, ugly design. That is just like, I look at it and I go, ah. And people have very little patience from a mobile application perspective with the poor end user experience. So that becomes also another factor, since mobile is the face that we all have to our customers and to one another increasingly. That's also driving a different approach to quality. And then, as we talked about, these very public software failures are increasing, and something that even my 13-year-old talks to me about. He just turned 13, he was 12. So the high cost of failure, again, these are things that we're all familiar with, but I wanted to bring them up again in the context of this level of complexity that we're all dealing with. So of course, there's lost revenue, and very, very significant lost revenue. We're talking, depending on the size of the failure and how long it goes for these major organizations, hundreds of millions of dollars, even billions. It's very, very significant if you're looking at the cumulative impact of these kinds of poor approaches to quality. Lost customers, obviously, and that happens immediately when it comes to mobile. If you're looking at social systems of engagement and the ways in which you draw in a broader audience, again, very significant impact in terms of lost customers. Looking at data analytics, How do you gain more customers and understand the data that's come to you from this sort of series of what we call the third platform types of platforms? And that's how you understand where to go next. So increased costs, obviously, you're all aware of that. When you look at technical debt, for instance, this is something that I talk about with some of my clients as well. The longer you wait to fix something that's a problem in production, the costlier it becomes. There's interest that accrues to technical debt. And so, and also if you find a problem in production, as we all know, is 10 to 100 times more expensive. But if you're looking at this combined platform, which is so impactful from a business perspective, the costs are prohibitive in ways that we haven't seen before in our industry. Damaged brand, lost productivity, lower profits, all of these are impacts of poor execution from a quality perspective in these environments. You don't have to say what it was, but who is seeing an issue here in their organization in the context of some of these kinds of applications, either mobile, social, data analytics, or cloud, that's been problematic within the last 12 months? And we won't ask what it was necessarily, but can you just raise your hand? Or someone that you know? Well, we've seen it, right, at IDC. So we don't have the best IT guys in the world. I mean, they're very nice. I'm sorry. I'll be an end user now. So we have really good IT people, but we don't have a lot of budget. So we're a bit of a cobbler's children type of syndrome in IDC. So good people, but not enough resources. And I expect that many organizations are that way as well, that I've potentially hear. So this is our definition of software quality analysis and measurement. A few years ago, we're trying to think more comprehensively about quality and moving beyond the sort of limited types of thinking about quality. And so what we came up with for the definition here are the software tools that enable organizations to observe, measure, and evaluate software complexity, size, productivity, and really importantly, risk, including technical and structural quality and non-functional testing. Okay, because what I tended to find in much of the research that I had been doing up until then was that we're really focusing on functional testing or performance stress and load testing, and we weren't getting to non-functional structural quality types of approaches to thinking about quality. And so we needed to broaden our thinking about this. And some of the categories of automation that we look at as part of this at IDC are architectural assessment of design consequences. So when you architect poorly, in that little video that Lev showed just now, there was a guy with a little diagram, right? And then the people, you couldn't see anything else, but there was at least a diagram. In many instances, there are poor diagrams. We did a house project for 3.5 years, my family and I, and we had multiple architects, right? And it was really interesting as we sort of created our house in an ad hoc way. It happens to be beautiful now, but it was a bit of a struggle. So when we're thinking about design from the get-go and you're thinking about end-to-end deployment of your software across these platforms, the assessment, the understanding of how you architected, what you did, and what the long-term impact is going to be on performance, on stability, on adaptability, and maintainability, that's really, really important. And often there's a disconnect between those who are architecting and those who are dealing with quality. Okay? Static analysis and dynamic analysis. Often we see these types of automated tools talked about in a security context. We need to bring security and quality together. We must. And my job as what I call IT therapist, what I try to do is bring people together across these domains. And that helps organizations to be more adaptive and more flexible and more successful here. Quality metrics for complexity, for size, for risk and productivity to help set baselines. So if you know where you were, you can know where you've gone. I think that Thomas was talking about that, also referring to that implicitly when he discussed some of the ways in which CAS is moving forward its next versions. We see that coming from other vendors as well, but an understanding really of what does this mean in terms of where we've been and also where our partners have been and the havoc they may have created inadvertently that we can't find, okay? So visibility is important, not to beat people over the head, because if you use these tools to do that, no one's gonna want you to use them, but to have that be a helpful baseline to then move forward and improve what you're doing. So there are human aspects to how you use these technologies that are really important to take into consideration and make sure that this is not a big brother type of opportunity to, to lay people off because they did something wrong, but rather you say, here, this is where we were, this is where we've been, and this is how you can improve and take that forward. Application portfolio evaluation, so how the dependencies, hierarchical dependencies of components on one another, and understanding the impact there is another key aspect of software quality analysis and measurement. It's not the most attractive sounding acronym, SQAM, but you know, at least it's what best we could do at the time. And then in-phase prevention of further software problems that aren't observable through the types of tools that you've typically seen as part of software quality. So these are some of the barriers to traditional testing that we've seen that have driven the adoption of these kinds of tools. So agile, the kind of velocity, the speed of agile, and the ways in which teams can become fractured and not so collaborative with small iterative sprints, but they're not coordinated, don't have the visibility. So you need frequent iterative testing that's automated. That's a driver for SQUAM. The lack of system resources, that constraining testing usage, you know, expense limits and the ability to mirror production configurations, kind of mobile issues, another driver. The lack of architectural context and understanding for multimodal. Multimodal is my fancy way of saying deploying software across cloud, social, and mobile and big data analytics, those pieces, and whatever comes next. Because we all know there are going to be new things that are already on the horizon and emerging now, right? Then challenges to test system configuration and the impact of performance and adaptability. The lack of visibility into consequences of poor architecture. How do you know what those consequences are without this kind of visibility, right? And then as I set the stage to begin with, these increasing very public failures of critical systems that are, and the ways in which those could potentially have been mitigated by the use of these types of automation approaches. So this is looking at IDC's forecast for this market here in the context of the overall automated software quality market. I'm looking out into 2018. We see that reaching about $1 billion, and software ASQ automated software quality going to about $3.6 billion. So you can see in 2013 is about 20% of the overall automated software quality market are these tools, and that's growing. I think the CAGR is around 15% over the 5-year forecast that we see here. So it's a very, there's a lot of interest in this because, again, this is business critical. This is something that enables you to avert the danger that has not yet come through visibility and understanding, okay? So there are these IT and business challenges, these gaps between both. So we have these highly visible applications that carry this high cost of failure. They're customer self-serve, supplier channel, key internal business applications, and then failure in one, there's a cascading effect to others, right, which we've all seen. Maybe we don't want to remember having seen it, but we have. And then the need for a SQUAM as part of the quality lifecycle, which we say is really, really important to pull in as part of your strategy when we're talking to folks from a lifecycle perspective. And there are these splits across groups from the business users and stakeholders, the architects, QA professionals, operational staff. So you have these fractured groups that increasingly have to coordinate with one another, which is why we're seeing the popularization of DevOps. For me, DevOps isn't just about release management and not merely tossing software over the wall. For me, it's end-to-end. It's from inception through design, through building, through change management of resilient applications, through to deployment, and then back to the operational piece so that there's an understanding of the whole as you feed new initiatives, right? That's why application portfolio management is a part of this market for us. In order to build new things, you need to know what's in your closet. Some people build software the way that I clean my office, which is I put a bunch of stuff in and I pile it up in the closet and I shut the door and hope no one opens it, right? The problem with software is you still have to maintain it, and it's expensive. My closet, I can shut the door. It doesn't really cost me anything except when I open it and something falls in my head. So the coordination of SQUAM as part of this life cycle is really important from our perspective. And then with this emerging market with SQUAM, it's interesting. We've seen, I don't know how many people see folks downloading Sonar, using Sonar Source at all in the organization. We see open source tools like that being an initial way in which organizations may get going with this type of analyzing, code analysis, and they aggregate the results and throw them into a dashboard. But it doesn't give them the level of depth and understanding that they need and the visibility and management for analytic reporting that we see being important, but it's a start. So there are ways in which organizations can bring in open source to get going, right? But we find more needing to occur here. So what's the goal of all this? Why is this important? What are we trying to do as IT organizations? And the goal is effective IT and business alignment. On the one hand, to innovate, to maximize the upside of what can happen through technology and to enable business processes. So you've got the business opportunity and then IT innovation to enable that with new business value. On the other hand, there's risk, right? So managing compliance issues, localization, global compliance issues, and then also dealing with very significant risk mitigation and security issues. So there's business risk management and there's IT risk management. And the benefit of this graphic, and the way I want you to think about it, is a way to consider how you coordinate with both IT and the business to do what the business needs. Now, I thought it would also be helpful to put in some survey information about what we see from the business side, what we saw earlier, actually. This is going into first part of 2014. We're about to come out with our 2015 surveys for what the business and IT are doing, right? So key issues moving into this year and throughout the year were organizational productivity. From the business perspective, business process agility and adaptability, new products and services, improved ones, reducing cost, increased revenue, customer acquisition, agility, and mitigating risk. Okay, it's an interesting order when you think about it, because risk from an IT perspective, if you look at the next slide, is up in the top 3. I think that you'd see that up in the top 3 for the business now too, going into the next year, because of how public and problematic those failures have been that we talked about to begin with. So application modernization, how do you take your existing applications and have a clue what's going on with them? I think there was an earlier example of someone using CAST to be able to understand what the impact was going to be of ditching their existing legacy application. And rather than doing that, it made better sense to mitigate that and invest whatever it was, I don't know, 5 million versus 30 million. I forget the numbers, but it was very significant. 3 million versus 15, I think, was the difference between mitigating what existed versus building again from scratch. So as you see organizations needing to leverage this existing base from which we're all operating, I'm standing on a platform here. And because it's fairly steady, I'm heavier than I was a few years ago, but I'm not going to break it, right? But I'm standing on this in a steady way. Same thing with these applications and the software on which many, many businesses are running. Those legacy applications need to be dealt with, but they're kind of invisible. We don't think about them. Mitigation is very helpful in the context of application modernization, that's the point of that little analogy. Big data, business analytics, again, very important to take all that cool data coming in from systems of engagement, and then also how, as you're moving that forward, understanding what that means and how you leverage that. Also getting data in the combination of mobile and social together. It's very potent, and there are huge volumes of that information across industries. And then security risk management. So I just thought I'd lay those out from an IT perspective as, again, drivers for adoption in this context. And then looking at the, oh, by the way, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy if you want to raise your hand and say, well, Melinda, I don't think that's true, or I have a question about this, or what do you mean there? I'm happy to take those. You can raise your hand if you are interested in saying something. I don't mind this being interactive. And then the functional areas undergoing the greatest transformation are sort of leading the push here. For IT spending. So marketing, security and risk, number 2, right? Customer service, again, important impact from the types of applications that we see here. So the 3 key challenges for IT, and this is kind of interweaving into the storyline I'm trying to build here. They have to build applications that generate greater business value with increasing criticality and a level of visibility, again, that we just haven't seen in prior years in the same way. This type of impact to the business is so lethal, at least until our attention changes to the next lethal problematic issue that someone else has had, right? The increasing complexity of software systems, which you talked about before, and how those come together to create a level of complexity that's just very difficult to manage. And then increasingly distributed teams with multi-sourcing, from onshore to offshore to open source, as I talked about before. And it's both open source from the use of components as well as open source tools that organizations are using that need to coordinate and have limited but increasing levels of functionality. And so you see many developers at the organizations that I deal with going out and grabbing that stuff and using it as a way to get going. And then it reaches a certain ceiling point and they need more, right? So we see the emergence of companies that makes open source more usable. Whether you're looking at Atlassian or you're looking at a bunch of organizations that do that, but they need to be used in conjunction with others. So I wanted to put a slide in here talking about the ways in which we see interesting use of metrics for increased visibility and technical debt reduction, okay? This is something that many of you may be familiar with, and that also is a part of what Bill's going to be presenting, looking at the recent research that Cass has done, which he'll be talking about as well. So establishing approaches for structural technical quality for effective architectural and good coding practices. And so structural quality is something, we're talking about non-functional quality and how organizations can take these pieces and pull them together to create an understanding of what's going on with their code kind of underneath the covers. And the elements to help determine application health, which again, Bill will be talking more about specifically in terms of the research that they've done, but I'm finding helpful with my clients as a way to just describe what can be useful to them. So robustness. And by robustness, we mean stability and application resilience, so that when you change the code, there are minimal defects that result because it's not brittle, right? Security, so being able to prevent unwanted intrusions. So how do you architect for that from the get-go? Performance, and by performance we mean efficiency in the context of resource and process time. And then changeability. By changeability, we're not talking about my mood, which hopefully is fairly even at the moment, but the ability to easily change and quickly modify the application. So it's both ease and speed, because the level of velocity around the need for these applications has increased so dramatically. And then how do you bring in new teams to be able to have a clue about how to deal with these applications? So transferability is what that relates to. And I think that that's going to be something, again, that Bill talks about more in terms of the specific research that CAST has done. And when you look at violations, these are structural problems in the source code that aren't aligned with good architectural or coding practices, and that increase both risk and cost. Usually the cost comes after the risk, but I put cost and risk because cost is what management thinks about first often. And risk is what needs to be thought about first actually from a process perspective, but that's what gets management to spend money, is what is it going to cost my business? What's the impact going to be? Per the earlier example, where we talked about this legacy application was going to cost $3 million to mitigate, $50 million to build new, let's mitigate it. Same thing with violations, right? And then technical debt. Who here has any technical debt in their organization? Hey, I got more hands. This is great. We're getting there. So the effort required to fix violations and release code and the cost and risk increase. There's an interest factor with technical debt that people often don't think about, right? They go, oh, yeah, there's that stuff I got to fix someday, right? But at the same time, because of the dynamism of the applications portfolios that we're dealing with, it's really, really problematic not to fix it. And the costs and risks, both together, increase the longer that those issues remain unresolved, okay? And so the other interesting thing is, as we think about it, other question, yeah, sure. Actually, the microphone, who can run another microphone over? Lev, a new job for you.
Ready to serve. Who is it? Over here.
On the technical debt, well, business may choose to live with certain types of violations, right? So those obviously would get excluded from technical debt.
Yes.
Or do you include all violations? Doesn't matter, because at some point it's going to hit you.
At some point, I missed the word.
At some point, the violation may hit you financially, right? So do you, in terms of computing the technical debt, do you consider all kinds of violations, or do you only consider business-approved violations?
Well, typically, that's an interesting question. The problem is that you can miss key technical debt problems if you're only going to be dealing with the business-approved violations on the one hand. So I think it's a more complex, that deserves a more complex question than it appears on the surface. One of the big problems, I think, with the organizations that I deal with is that they only think about technical debt as what they've already identified. And there may be really pernicious debt that they haven't observed that isn't visible to them. The proverbial example that we all know, if any of us have seen the movie, is of course the Titanic, right? Where you had an iceberg that was under the water. And so generally speaking, my answer would be yes. But the caveat to that is that without visibility into what the real problems are, you don't know, right? And so I think that one of the reasons that I advise my clients to create effective strategies around software quality analysis and measurement is to be able to identify what is there and what is problematic and what the impact of that's going to be. Then you can also prioritize your resources to fix what's going to be most impactful first. So I don't know if that answered the question. I guess a quick answer would be no, it's not enough to only say business identified issues are going to be what we're talking about as technical debt. That's insufficient, would be my analyst answer. From a pragmatic perspective, is that what people do? Yes. Is that a problem? Yes. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks for that response. Actually, there are certain violations with which actually business may say, let's live with it, because cost of fixing it is not commensurate with the return, right? So you may choose not to really bother about that unless it starts hitting you really hard in the future time. So.
That's, of course, completely true. I mean, pragmatically, you have limited budget, limited people, limited time, and you're going to focus on what's going to be the biggest problem to the organization. However, without visibility, you may be making the wrong choice, and you likely will sometimes. But we as human beings, we're fallible. We do the best we can with what we know at any time. And we have to be somewhat compassionate with where we are to some extent. But on the other, these very public examples of ways in which organizations have made wrong choices about this are driving us into better hygiene and better behavior, which I think is a good thing. Okay? Any other questions about what I've said so far, or, okay. Cool. So there's this interesting thing about function points. Who here has used function points ever in their career? Who here of these people who have used function points have been happy with function points and what they measure? Okay. Not a single hand, okay? So,
The clients are happy.
I'm sorry, what?
The clients are happy.
The clients are happy, right? And it's particularly problematic if you're using function points in a more complex world to identify productivity or lack thereof based on inadequate information and ineffective understanding, okay? So one thing that I like that I've been hearing and seeing organizations doing and thinking about more proactively is how do we take these numbers on which we have to deliver stuff being software, right, and make them meaningful in ways that are going to help us understand both the quality of what we're doing and the quality of that level of experienced resource in delivering on that level of complexity engagement. Because not all function points are equal, and the level of complexity of different projects varies very significantly. If you don't have visibility to that, then you don't have an understanding about how to use them well. So one thing that I like that I'm hearing is a coming together of this kind of code analysis and quality analysis and measurement as part of what you do with function points and integrating them, marrying them together, okay? Because then you begin to have an opportunity to do something, maybe it's not entirely meaningful, but it's more meaningful. It makes sense in a different kind of way. And is it everything? No, but it's a step in the right direction of setting baselines that are actually related to what people are doing from a productivity perspective, and then moving forward. We were here, now we're here. This is what that means in the context of this particular code base. So I see this as hopeful, okay? I tend to be an optimist anyway, but I like this. Now, this is some research we did a while back on the top challenges in launching mobile applications. I bring it up because who here does not have a mobile application in the organization that's important to them? Who here does? Okay, yeah, right. We do too at IDC. And so, if you look at the investing and maintaining varied mobile infrastructure, that's one issue. Constantly changing infrastructure, that's an issue, and the expertise in developing skill sets across the platforms, but then designing these applications well, right? If you look at the leading challenges concern the level of investment and maintenance required to support rapidly evolving infrastructure on the one hand, and then building up or accessing resource expertise in design, development, and testing of mobile apps. Testing mobile apps is challenging, and there are many levels around those challenges for testing of mobile applications. Whether you're looking at there's the device piece, there's the operating system, there's the functionality of the applications. And yet these are really, really important. This is our face to the world, okay? And so what we're finding is that organizations are increasingly trying to structure better approaches to this, and this ties in clearly with the messaging that we talked about before. Now, security. This is looking at our cloud survey that we did, and that security was and risk is playing a major role in organizations as they're looking at cloud by a significant factor. And this is a relatively recent survey, and we see this continuing to be the case, whether you're talking about public cloud, private cloud, or hybrid. Hybrid, of course, being a very significant portion of what we see our clients doing. And I think that the pulling together of a strategy of quality that encompasses these environments, these emerging very important environments, is key, as we talked about before. Social isn't here, but we can imagine it. You see it on the wall over there, for instance. Okay. So coordinating across the life cycle, taking architectural design, requirements, software analysis, quality, and operational performance, creating an end-to-end strategy around that and how these components are dependent, how they interact with each other and what the consequences are is really important. And failures and slow response time, it's cost prohibitive, right, for many of these organizations, and we see that in the context of some of these other companies that are struggling, right? We recommend that organizations leverage quality automation from design and requirements through the testing cycle across these platforms. As I've said before, I think I may be sounding a bit like a broken record, and yet it is something that I increasingly see as something that I say repeatedly in different kinds of ways to all the clients who come to me with quality questions. And we are recommending organizations evaluate what's out there from an automated perspective. What do you have? The market is not, it's not apples to apples. There are different products that do different kinds of things here. And that's partly why the definition that we have has several pieces to it. Because in order to understand and effectively execute in these environments, there needs to be a variegated a functional set of capabilities that are here. CAST has many of these, which is why you're sitting here and why I'm talking here. Business requirements change. You have to have a lifecycle approach that enables organizations to be dynamic as well and adaptive, right, and responsive. So whether you're looking at agile approaches in this context or you're looking at the ways in which you need to deploy adaptively across these multiple platforms, there has to be a different kind of flexibility and resilience to how you go about doing this as you bring your business and IT people together. And we see that there are various alternatives. We talked a little bit about open source. There are other automated higher-end products in this context. And how you start on this, how you get your people involved and engaged. Typically, we see people targeting smaller initiatives and then leveraging the successes there to build out a case to management and say, look what we're able to do here. And that tends to work better than any kind of big bang approach unless you have very significant top-level down support for making a transition to this type of strategy. And then, as we talked about in the other slide, the structural, technical, non-functional factors are key for application health. And we gave some examples of aspects of application health that can give you kind of a metric for understanding, where your organization is at with your portfolio. So our call to action, a little trumpet call, this is what we encourage organizations to do. And part of our job as analysts is out to the field and to you and to our client base and others is to help people improve their behavior and to be more successful. So poorly designed, problematic software, it's really, really impactful right now to you and to others. And there's human cost, there's business cost, very significant pain in this environment. When you talk about fear, uncertainty, and doubt, there it is, right? And so there is a push to change behavior here and to make things better. That's the positive side of FUD. There's enough pain. When there's enough pain, we'll change. Human beings are way more wired for consistency than we are for change. And even when we're well inspired to do something differently, like me jogging every morning, for instance, do you make changes in your personal behavior very frequently? It's hard to change, right? So Darwin was right, but only when death was the alternative, right? And so what you want to do is take that as a spur to action and to change, and then leverage that challenge to be able to make a significant shift in what you're doing from a quality perspective. So these challenges of increased complexity and high-end development across these various platforms, it increases problems. It makes it much harder to be successful and increases costs, and there are these debilitating consequences that we talked about, both pre and post-deployment, okay? And I want us to be thinking more than just beyond this myopic sense of this phase, this phase, this phase, this phase, or this group, this group, this group. We want to act locally, but think globally in how we develop software, not only politically. I think we need to be that way politically. I think we need to be that way also in the context of software development. So as companies are becoming better educated about the business consequences and labor costs of poor software design, they move beyond this optimism. People have this sense they're much better off than they actually are. And we see that in surveys with IDC as well, that you ask people how well they're doing, and hey, I'm doing great. And then you ask them specifically, well, what were the numbers of problems you had? And then, it's voluminous, right? So there's a difference between this sort of sense of false optimism that people have. And part of this visibility that you get in a pragmatic way to say this is what is actually going on is you give people a stepping stone, a ladder to be able to say this is where we are, this is where we're going to now, and they have real tools to make good decisions about where to focus and how to improve what they're doing, which to me, again, is hopeful. So we recommend that organizations evaluate these kinds of automated tools to supplement their traditional automated software quality. It's not that you replace one with the other. We're talking about a broader way of thinking about quality that is synergistic. And it's very important to think about it that way as you bring in both your security people on the one hand and your quality and your testing people on the other, and then move that to end-to-end operations, as I think somebody over here was discussing before earlier, that you want to take that good pre-deployment piece and then move it to ops, right? Along with, now don't let me neglect organizational and process approaches. You can have the best technology in the world, but if people aren't using it in the right way at the right time, or not using it, period, it won't do you any good, okay? So that cultural and organizational change is critical here, and good processes and workflow around it. So in summary, again, we recommend we tell you to coordinate a quality lifecycle approach that targets pragmatic approaches to SQUAM, from design, architecture, through to deployment to obtain the benefits, and an understanding of the way these components coordinate and play together or don't. Evaluate your current strategies, the gaps that you have for design, application portfolio review, effective quality process, and automated tools adoption. So broaden out the thinking that you have in your organization. Obviously, you're sitting here already, but there may be management or other people who really don't think that this is important and don't have a clue about what the potential business cost and consequences and risks are to them of not shifting their thinking beyond the narrow focus around quality that has been typically what they do. So, and there are typically schisms between business folks, the stakeholders, the architects, development, testers, and operations, right? Everyone has their own little area, and I find there's just this very significant sense still, more than there should be, that the operations guys go, what is this junk that you guys are throwing over the wall at me, right? And then the developers think sort of similarly about the architects, and they ignore what they're doing. So that's changing more now. There's a real sense of people having to come together because of the complexity of what needs to get done, but that has to change. And the common visibility into what things look like can be depolarizing. It can be an opportunity to say, here's a descriptive understanding of what's happening here. Not being passionately aggressive about, well, you created this piece of whatever, right? But saying, this is where we're at, and this is what we can do to fix it. It's simple. It's clearer. And so I think that the benefit of this type of information is that it can create a different kind of coordination across these teams that are typically fractured from one another. It provides common metrics also for understanding where people are at. But again, not as a bludgeon, but merely descriptively to say, here we are, and this is where we need to be. And then drive towards an effective quality strategy to help cut costs, increase efficiency, business agility, to sustain brand and address competitive challenges. One of the interesting things that we're seeing is kind of combination also, if we look at agile or agility, pulling that together with existing waterfall to kind of create a combined approach is sort of interesting way that we're seeing companies bringing people together and doing something differently around that agile piece. So there's a fairly dorky picture of myself. Hopefully I don't look quite that way, but it's fine. And I'm glad to take any questions you guys may have about this. Hopefully that was helpful to you. And I'm also glad at any point if this perspective will be useful to bring in a third party to have a conversation with your people internally. I love talking about these things. And I'm glad to just come in and chat or whatever. And I'm fairly generous with my time.